Imagine you wrote the rulebook. Not borrowed it, not studied it, not absorbed it from mentors or books or hard experience over a few years of trading. You wrote it. From scratch. From 40 years of the most expensive, the most rigorous, the most brutally honest self-examination any trader in American history ever conducted. You identified the mistakes, named them, traced them back to their psychological roots, articulated the principles with a clarity that people are still quoting a century later, that protect against those mistakes. You wrote the rulebook, and then you broke every rule in it. Not once, not in a moment of weakness you didn't see coming. Repeatedly, knowingly, in full possession of the exact framework that explained why what you were doing was wrong, and precisely what it was going to cost you. This is not a hypothetical, this is Jesse Livermore, the specific, documented, historically verified reality of a man who understood trading psychology more deeply than almost anyone who has ever lived, and who still could not consistently apply what he understood to his own behavior. He knew what hope does to a trader. He wrote about it, he warned others about it, and he held losing positions on hope long past the point his own rules condemned. He knew what confidence does after a winning streak. He identified the mechanism. He described the exact sequence by which success erodes discipline, and he lived that sequence, more than once, in trades that cost him fortunes he had spent years building. He knew what averaging down means, had watched it destroy every trader he'd ever seen attempt it, had written about its inevitable consequences with the authority of someone who had observed the pattern across decades. And he averaged down. On cotton, on grain, on positions that were clearly broken, clearly violating his own framework, clearly doing exactly what he had predicted such positions would do. The man who wrote the rule book broke every rule in it. And the question that I keep coming back to, the one that I think matters more than any technical principle in trading, is why. Not how. Not in what market, or in what year, or under what set of external conditions. Why? Why does knowing not protect you? Why is understanding the mistake not sufficient to prevent the mistake? Why did the greatest trading mind of his era keep returning to the same errors that his own thinking had long since identified and condemned? That question is what this episode is about. And the answer, Livermore's answer, arrived at through 40 years of living the contradiction, is more uncomfortable than anything else in his work. There's a word that appears in Livermore's writing that most people read past. It shows up in different forms, in different contexts, but it's always pointing at the same thing. The word is know. He writes about what traders know and don't know, about the things he knew and did anyway, about the gap between knowing and doing that he observed in himself and in every trader he respected. At one point he writes, and this is almost unbearable in its honesty when you understand the context, that the lessons of his mistakes were clear to him long before he stopped making them. Read that again. The lessons were clear before he stopped making the mistakes. He wasn't waiting for understanding. He had understanding. What he was waiting for, what apparently required years of additional expensive experience to arrive at, was something else. Something that understanding alone couldn't provide. This distinction matters enormously because most of how we think about improvement in trading, most of how trading education is structured, including most of what gets discussed in podcasts exactly like this one, assumes that understanding is the path to change. That if you can explain clearly enough why a particular mistake happens and what it costs and how to recognize it in real time, the explanation will produce different behavior. Livermore's life is the most detailed, most expensive, most thoroughly documented argument against that assumption. He could explain every mistake he made with forensic precision. He could predict in advance exactly what the violation of his own rules would cost. He could articulate the psychological mechanism behind each bad decision with a clarity that would make a behavioral economist nod, and he kept making the mistakes. Not always. Not without long stretches of extraordinary discipline that produced extraordinary results, but repeatedly enough and in high-stakes enough contexts that the pattern has to be taken seriously rather than explained away as aberration or weakness. Understanding was not sufficient. Something else was required, something that understanding, for all its value, couldn't reach. To understand what that something was, You have to understand something about Jesse Livermore that goes beyond his trading, something about who he became in the world, and what that becoming cost him. By the time Livermore entered his 50s, by the time the greatest trades of his career were behind him and the most difficult period of his life was beginning, he was not just a trader, he was a legend. Not in the way that word gets used casually, literally. He was famous in the way that very few people in finance have ever been famous. His trades were covered in newspapers. His opinions on markets were solicited by journalists and sought by other speculators. The story of how he made $100 million in the crash of 1929 was known, told, retold, mythologized across the entire financial community of his era. He was Jesse Livermore, the boy plunger, the greatest speculator alive. That identity, that specific public broadly acknowledged identity, was not separable from how he experienced himself as a trader. It had become part of the architecture of his self-understanding, part of what he knew himself to be. And here is where the problem begins, where the gap between knowing and doing becomes not just psychological, but structural. Because the rules that Livermore had spent 40 years developing, the rules that had produced the results that created the legend, were rules designed for a specific kind of trader. A trader who was humble, a trader who was still in the process of proving something, a trader for whom patience was a genuine option because sitting out was not a failure of identity, it was simply waiting for the right conditions. The legend that Livermore had become could not easily be that trader, not because the rules had changed, not because the methodology was wrong, but because following the rules completely, cutting losses immediately, sitting on cash for extended periods, reducing size during adverse conditions, doing the patient, undramatic, unglamorous work of waiting, required a quality of ego dissolution that is difficult for any human being, and that is specifically acutely difficult for a human being who has become a public symbol of trading mastery. Jesse Livermore cutting a loss and sitting on cash for 3 months looks like Jesse Livermore getting it wrong, looks like the legend slipping, looks like the man who predicted the crash of 1929 having an off year. Jesse Livermore adding to a losing position, swinging for the recovery, even though the rules condemned it absolutely, at least looked like Jesse Livermore doing something, acting, engaging, being the aggressive, decisive, large-scale operator that the legend required him to be. The identity had become a constraint on the behavior the identity was built on. The legend was eating the methodology that created it. This is a specific kind of trap that Livermore never fully named, perhaps because naming it would have required a degree of self-examination that was, even for him, too uncomfortable to sustain. Call it the identity trap. Here's how it works. You build something over time, a reputation, a self-concept, a story about who you are and what you're capable of. That story is built from real achievements, real trades, real results, real demonstrations of capability that the world has witnessed and acknowledged. The story is true, that's important. It's not delusion, it's accurate history. But history is backward-looking, and markets are always only right now. The story of who you are, built from the past, accurate about the past, genuinely reflecting real achievements from the past, begins to function as a filter on present-moment perception. You start to interpret current situations through the lens of the identity, to make decisions that are consistent with the story of who you are, rather than decisions that are appropriate to the specific conditions in front of you. A trader who is the greatest speculator alive does not sit on cash for months waiting for a clean setup. That's not what the greatest speculator alive does. A trader who is the greatest speculator alive does not take small, conservative positions and wait for confirmation before adding. That's not how you become the greatest speculator alive. A trader who is the greatest speculator alive does not cut a loss quickly and walk away. That's not the bold, decisive, large-scale operation that the identity requires. The identity doesn't make these decisions consciously. It doesn't sit down and reason through them. It operates below awareness, as a constant shaping force on what options even feel available. Cutting the loss at the right level doesn't feel wrong. It just doesn't feel available. It's not in the repertoire of someone with Livermore's identity, not in the moments when the position is under pressure and the decision has to be made quickly. What's available, what feels like the options, are the moves that are consistent with the story. Hold, add, make the big call, recover decisively. Be the trader the reputation says you are. Even when the methodology, the rule book written by that same reputation, says otherwise. Livermore wrote about this contradiction, though not in these exact terms. He wrote about it in a way that is heartbreaking when you understand the full context, when you know what it cost him to arrive at that level of honesty. He wrote about the difference between what a trader knows in theory and what a trader can access under pressure. He used a specific image, one that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in his body of work. He compared the trader under pressure to a man who has studied medicine his entire life, who understands anatomy and physiology and the treatment protocols for every common emergency, but who, when faced with a genuine medical crisis, hands trembling and adrenaline flooding his system, cannot access the knowledge clearly, cannot move through the protocols with the precision that the classroom required, cannot separate what he knows from what the physical reality of the emergency is doing to his capacity to think. The knowledge is real, the training is real, the understanding is genuine, but understanding exists in a different state than the one the emergency creates. And in the state the emergency creates, the understanding is not as accessible as it was in the classroom, not as clear, not as actionable. Trading under pressure is always an emergency. Every significant decision, every moment when the position is large and moving adversely, and the rules say one thing and the hope says another, is, neurologically, an emergency. The threat response machinery is engaged. The clarity of the classroom is not available. And Livermore was saying something even harder than that. He was saying that for a trader who had become a public symbol, whose identity was entangled with the results in a way that made every significant loss an identity threat as well as a financial one, the emergency was even more acute, the neurological activation even more intense, the gap between what was known and what was accessible even wider. The legend made the emergency worse, because for most traders, a bad trade is a financial setback and a psychological blow. For Livermore, by the later years of his career, a bad trade was a financial setback and a psychological blow and a public event. Something that the financial press might notice. Something that the community of speculators who had watched him perform for decades would interpret and discuss. Something that had implications not just for the account, but for the story. And the part of the human mind that protects the story, that defends the identity, that cannot tolerate the narrative of the greatest speculator alive getting it badly wrong, is not subject to override by the rulebook. However clearly the rulebook is written, however deeply the rules are understood. Now I want to go somewhere that most discussions of Livermore carefully avoid, because the standard narrative of his failures, the one that appears in financial writing, in trading education, in the places where his story gets told, attributes his losses to specific external factors, to market conditions that changed, to tip following that violated his principles, to personal circumstances that distracted him from the discipline his methodology required. All of those things are true. They all played a role. But they're also to some degree convenient, because they locate the failure outside the methodology itself. They preserve the rulebook as sound, while finding explanations for why the rulebook wasn't followed. Livermore's own writing suggests something more honest, more difficult. He suggests that the rulebook, for all its genuine wisdom, for all the real value it contains, was not sufficient. Not because the rules were wrong, because rules, by themselves, are not the thing that produces consistent behavior under pressure. Rules are intellectual formulations. They exist in the part of the mind that does analysis, that constructs frameworks, that reasons through situations in the calm space of reflection. That part of the mind is genuinely capable of generating the kind of wisdom that Livermore's rules represent. But that part of the mind is not the part that makes decisions under pressure. Under pressure, the decisions are made by older, faster, more powerful systems, systems that were built for survival, not for financial markets, systems that respond to identity threat and social threat and the immediate discomfort of loss with the same urgency that they respond to physical danger. Rules don't reach those systems, not directly, not reliably, not in the moments when the pressure is highest and the need for the rules is most acute. What reaches those systems is something different, something that Livermore gestured at in his writing without ever fully articulating, perhaps because he was a trader, not a psychologist, and the vocabulary for what he was observing didn't fully exist in his era. What reaches those systems is not rules, it's something closer to character, to the deep, below-conscious, habitually ingrained patterns of response that operate automatically, without deliberation, in the moments when there isn't time for the rulebook. Character in this sense is not something you decide to have, it's something that gets built, slowly through consistent practice, through the repeated choice to act in alignment with your principles even when it's uncomfortable, even when the identity argues otherwise, even when the pressure is high and the emergency feeling is real. Every time Livermore followed his rules in a difficult moment, every time he cut a loss at the right level, despite the identity pressure to hold, every time he sat on cash, despite the legend pressure to act, he was building something at that deeper level, something more durable than knowledge. And every time he broke the rules, every time the identity won over the methodology, he was eroding it. The tragedy in Livermore's case was not that he didn't understand this. The tragedy is that he did understand it, clearly, articulately, with a precision that produced the best trading framework of his era, and the understanding still wasn't always enough. The gap between knowing and being remained open for his entire career, narrowing in his best periods, widening in his worst ones, never fully closing. Here's what I want you to sit with, not as trading advice, as an honest question about your own relationship with your methodology. You have rules, maybe formally written, maybe internalized from experience, maybe a combination, but you have them. You know what you're supposed to do when a position moves against you. You know what position sizing is appropriate for your account and your risk tolerance. You know when conditions are genuinely favorable and when they aren't. You know what a forced trade looks like versus a real setup. You know these things. Now ask yourself, honestly, without the softening that self-assessment usually involves, how often does knowing them translate to doing them in the specific moments when doing them is hard? Not when the trade is working and the methodology is being validated in real time. When it's hard, when the position is down and the pressure is up and the voice in your head is building the case for an exception. When the identity, whatever yours is, at whatever scale your career has built it, is in the room, making its own argument for why this situation is different. In those moments, the gap that Livermore lived with, the gap between what he knew and what he could access under pressure, how wide is yours? Most traders, if they're honest, will find it wider than they expected. Not because they haven't studied enough or thought deeply enough or built a good enough framework. Because the gap is not a knowledge problem. Never was. It's the distance between the part of you that wrote the rules and the part of you that has to execute them in real time, in a threatened state with real money and real identity on the line. Livermore spent 40 years trying to close that distance. He closed it enough to produce results that stand alone in the history of American finance. He couldn't close it completely, and in the periods when it opened wider than usual, when the identity was loudest and the pressure was highest and the rules were most needed and least accessible, the cost was everything he had built. There's a final thing Livermore wrote that I want to leave you with, not as a lesson, not as a takeaway, just as a thing he said at the end of a long career with the full weight of everything it had contained that deserves to be heard without commentary. He wrote that the markets had taught him everything he needed to know about himself, not about stocks, not about speculation, not about the mechanics of how prices move or how supply and demand interact or how to read the tape, about himself. That the market in 40 years had served as the most precise and unsparing mirror he had ever looked into. That every failure, every moment when the rules were broken and the identity won and the account paid the price, had reflected back something real and specific about who he was at that moment, about the gap that existed between who he knew himself to be and who he actually was under the specific pressures that markets create. He said the education was worth it, not comfortable, not something he would have chosen if he had known in advance what it would cost, but worth it. Because what the markets showed him about himself, however expensive the showing, Faust, was true. And truth, however uncomfortable, is more useful than the comfortable alternatives. He knew himself by the end in a way that very few people ever do. The knowing didn't always protect him, but it was real. And maybe that's the most honest answer to the question this episode started with. Why does knowing not protect you? Because knowing and being known are different things. Livermore at his best was both. At his worst, he was only the first. The gap between them, that distance, that space, that unresolvable tension between understanding yourself and being yourself under pressure, is not something that gets closed with more knowledge. It gets closed, if it gets closed at all, with something harder. Something that takes longer. Something that the markets will keep testing in every trader who takes them seriously for as long as they're in the game.